A rental car comes back with the hood bent like a taco, the passenger mirror completely gone, and a dent shaped exactly like a shopping cart, and the customer's explanation was that the parking lot was shaped like an optical illusion, documented, straight-faced, submitted to a real company. We have 49 more exactly like it. People who returned rental cars looking like war zone survivors and wrote explanations that defied physics, common sense, and basic human accountability. If you do not subscribe before this video is over, we are going to assume you are one of them. Hit subscribe right now so we know you are one of the good ones, like if you have ever blamed a parking lot, and drop your most unhinged excuse in the comments because number 23 is going to make you feel a lot better about yourself. 1. The return desk at that rental location had seen countless explanations over many years, but nothing had remotely prepared the agent for a grown adult describing a bumper separation caused entirely by a seagull. The eye contact was prolonged and aggressive, and every functioning brain cell abandoned its post simultaneously. The bumper apparently made the exact same decision and detached itself from the vehicle out of pure, overwhelming solidarity with everyone involved in that parking lot. 2. Optical illusions belong in museums and dentist waiting rooms and absolutely nowhere near a parking lot. But whoever designed that particular structure had completely different ideas about appropriate placement. The result was a space where forward and diagonal and reverse all looked identical from the driver's seat. The concrete barrier at the far end was the only object in that entire facility that knew exactly where it was and what it was about to do. 3. A Walgreens got completely and unexpectedly pulled into a three-point turn that had no business traveling in the direction it went. The third point landed directly inside the entrance with breathtaking confidence. Even the automatic doors slid open cooperatively, like they had been quietly anticipating this exact moment for a very long time. Nobody standing inside that building was emotionally prepared for what came rolling through those doors that afternoon. 4. Fluorescent vests communicate authority, and the wave from that particular vest was so commanding and overflowing with conviction. Surrendering everything to it felt like the only reasonable decision any adult could make in that moment. The fact that the man was simply stretching and had zero awareness that an entire rental car had committed to his gesture arrived several seconds too late. Several expensive seconds too late to help anybody involved. 5. Drive-through speaker boxes are bolted permanently into the ground and have never once moved toward an approaching vehicle in the entire history of fast food. But this particular one apparently had a completely different agenda that afternoon. It came directly at the car with no warning whatsoever. There were 3 people sitting in the back seat who witnessed every single moment of it and are fully prepared to confirm that exact version of events. 6. Tires operate under a basic mechanical agreement with the vehicle they are attached to. That agreement includes finishing the journey without making any unilateral decisions about participation. But this particular tire clearly felt differently about its obligations. The debate at the rental return desk about whether it technically blew out or simply made a conscious personal choice to stop contributing to the trip is one the agent was philosophically not prepared to have on a Tuesday. 7. The bumper sticker said "Baby on board" in large friendly letters, and 12 generous feet of following distance were provided immediately. It came from a deeply held sense of civic responsibility and genuine human decency. The person directly behind, who apparently could not read, made contact without hesitation. Suddenly, every single person in that parking lot had a very loud and very detailed opinion about what had just happened and who was responsible for it. 8. Emotional support water bottles are a legitimate and widely accepted part of modern life. Nobody in this era of chronic stress should be judged for requiring one during a long drive. But when that bottle rolled directly under the brake pedal during a spiritually exposed and emotionally fragile moment on the interstate, everything changed. The stopping distance transformed from a mechanical measurement into something closer to a philosophical question with a very unfortunate and expensive answer. 9. butterflies are weightless and harmless, and land on surfaces constantly without triggering any response from the universe. But this particular one landed on the windshield with such deliberate and unusual timing that it genuinely felt like a warning being delivered from somewhere beyond ordinary traffic. The overcorrection into the median that followed was an entirely reasonable response. Receiving what appeared to be a direct cosmic message at highway speed deserves at least that level of reaction. 10. Gas station canopies have existed at a standardized clearance height that vehicles have passed under without incident for decades across every state. The assumption going in was that this one would be no different, but whoever installed this particular canopy had a fundamentally different relationship with measurements and standard conventions. The roof of the rental car gathered that information firsthand before any signage in the vicinity had the opportunity to communicate it in a more helpful and less expensive way. 11. Nobody was looking at a phone during this incident, and establishing that fact clearly before anything else is extremely important. The distraction was not the phone itself, but the persistent and consuming thought of the phone possibly buzzing with unread messages. That distinction between physically using a device and merely thinking about it is a meaningful and legitimate one that deserves serious consideration. The mirror disagrees entirely, but the mirror was not present for the internal cognitive experience. 12. The sun had been sitting aggressively in the windshield for several miles, making everything difficult. Then it shifted position and disappeared completely. It was specifically that brief transitional period between blinding and not blinding where the brain was busy recalibrating. The side mirror found something solid to introduce itself to, and the timing aligned so precisely with the sun moving that meteorology should honestly be sharing a meaningful portion of the responsibility at this return desk. 13. An ice cream cone dropped in slow motion onto the sidewalk at exactly the moment the car was passing. The face that appeared on the child holding it was so completely and specifically devastating that an audible gasp escaped from inside the vehicle. The wheel turned in the direction of that gasp because the body and the emotions had briefly merged into one operating unit. The curb was positioned exactly where feelings should never be allowed to make steering decisions. 14. Parallel parking on a public street should be a straightforward interaction between a vehicle and two painted white lines. But the street itself was sitting at an angle that no licensed engineer would ever sign off on. The car appeared perfectly centered from inside, but visibly wrong from outside. The infrastructure of this country has been quietly failing drivers in small and expensive ways for many years, and this was simply the most recent entry in that very long record. 15. Somewhere inside that rental car, there was a spider, and the not knowing was the single most destabilizing part of the entire experience. Every small movement in the peripheral vision became a candidate, and every faint sensation became a confirmation. The damage that occurred during the active and increasingly frantic search belongs entirely to the spider. It belongs to the spider regardless of whether it can be physically produced as supporting evidence at the return counter by anyone. 16. A pigeon arrived on the hood with the settled and unbothered energy of someone who had secured permanent housing and was not entertaining any offers to leave. It remained through the entirety of a parking garage visit with extraordinary confidence. By the time the exit ramp appeared, the pigeon had fully integrated into the mental landscape of the drive. Pulling away with it still sitting there delivering quiet judgment felt completely normal until the moment it very much did not. 17. The heads-up display projected the current speed directly onto the windshield, which sounds genuinely useful as a feature, until it overlapped with a stop sign at a perfectly unfortunate angle and the stop sign disappeared entirely behind the numbers. Someone at that automotive company sat in a meeting and approved that design and sent it into the world. That specific person should be physically present at this conversation happening right now at the rental return desk today. 18. Wind generated by a passing semi-truck is a documented and measurable physical force that affects smaller vehicles in predictable ways. But what happened to the driver's side door during that encounter went beyond anything standard physics would comfortably explain. The gust arrived at exactly the right frequency, and the door responded by separating from the vehicle. It felt less like an accident and more like something that had been quietly planned and finally found the right moment to happen. 19. 1 mile per hour under the speed limit is a very specific and uniquely personal kind of provocation that builds gradually. The decision to pass was reached after considerable emotional investment and executed with total commitment. The pass stretched across so much road and consumed so many mental resources that the lane ending ahead never registered as actionable information. The car expressed its feelings about the entire situation in a way that required an official damage report to properly document. 20. Spotify shuffled to a song from 2009 without any warning, and the year came flooding back all at once. Every feeling and every memory and every version of life that existed before everything became complicated arrived simultaneously. The surface street outside kept happening in real time, while the brain had relocated to an entirely different era. The damage that resulted is less a traffic incident and more accurately a physical artifact of unresolved personal history making contact with a curb. 21. That rental car smelled exactly like a grandmother's house, and not in any vague or general way. It was the hyper-specific and emotionally loaded version that includes the exact brand of fabric softener and something warm baking in the oven. The four-way stop materialized while the brain was fully situated in a completely different decade with zero interest in returning to the present. The present moment where traffic rules still applied was simply going to have to wait. 22. Billboard personal injury lawyers have exactly one professional purpose, and that purpose is reminding drivers to pay attention while operating a vehicle. This particular billboard was fulfilling that purpose with enormous bold letters spelling out that distracted driving kills. The careful and thorough reading of every single word on that sign happened at full highway speed. The message arrived in the brain approximately half a second after the moment when having that information would have made any practical difference to anyone. 23. Sneezing while driving appears nowhere in any driver education manual as a legitimate structural threat to surrounding infrastructure. But this sneeze was operating at a category that standard sneezes simply do not reach. The wheel rotated with the full force of it, and the soul briefly left the body the way it sometimes does during a truly catastrophic sneeze. When everything returned to its original position, the side mirror had introduced itself to a nearby wall and clearly preferred that arrangement permanently. 24. Parking lots operate under an unspoken social agreement, where all moving objects maintain awareness of everything around them. But the person crossing that lot was moving at a pace so disconnected from normal human locomotion that tracking them required every available unit of concentration. The rear of the car quietly ceased to exist as relevant information during that period. The object sitting behind registered its objection through the only communication method available to stationary things, which is immediate, direct, and leaves a mark. 25. The return lane was clearly designed by someone who had a deeply complicated personal relationship with the concept of direction. Every single arrow painted on that ground was pointing somewhere completely different, with full institutional confidence and zero coordination between them. Following the system required a total surrender of personal judgment to arrows that had never tested their own instructions. The bollard positioned at the very end had been quietly and patiently collecting the consequences of that design philosophy for a very long time. 26. Bright yellow is universally recognized as the most attention-grabbing color available to the human eye. That bollard was painted in the most aggressive and uncompromising shade of it that exists. Yet the brain processed it as background decoration, the same automatic way it processes school buses and yield signs and taxicabs. Anything that is permanently yellow eventually stops reading as a warning, and that is a fundamental design failure and absolutely not a driving competency issue for anyone to comment on. 27. The parking structure ticketing machine was clearly installed by someone who had never once sat in the driver's seat of an actual vehicle. Reaching it required leaning out of the window at an angle so extreme that the body weight shifted in a way the car interpreted as a deliberate steering input. The wall on the left received that input with immediate enthusiasm. The parking ticket was never successfully retrieved, and the wall expressed absolutely no remorse about its involvement in the situation. 28. Roads in this country contain potholes, and that is a known and accepted fact of American driving that everyone has adjusted their expectations around. But this particular pothole was functioning at a scale that suggested it had applied for its own zip code and a street name. The undercarriage of the rental car collected that information at full cruising speed before any signal from the road surface had time to translate into a reduction of velocity. The rental agent called it damage, and the pothole considers it a relationship. 29. Seat warmers are supposed to represent the quieter and more civilized end of the driving experience. But the one in that rental car had developed a completely independent agenda and activated itself at the maximum setting without being asked. The subsequent search for the button that would end the situation became the only cognitive priority for 45 full seconds. The road ahead communicated its increasing frustration through a method that bypassed the dashboard entirely and went straight to the bumper without any further warning. 30. Wide load signs exist on trucks to deliver a specific and spatially important message about the dimensions of the vehicle ahead. But processing those two words as a personal and immediate warning rather than a general administrative trucking notice requires a level of highway reading comprehension the brain was not performing it during that stretch of road. The rental car learned what wide actually measured in real physical space before the sign had finished being understood by anyone sitting behind the wheel that afternoon. 31. Coffee at the wrong temperature creates a specific kind of hostage situation where setting it down is not possible because the cup holder is too shallow. Drinking it is not possible because the temperature is still mid-negotiation between too hot and acceptable. That unresolved liminal state of holding something that cannot be acted upon in any direction consumed enough active mental bandwidth. The fender eventually located its own resolution to the situation and submitted it directly to the rental return agent as a line item. 32. Rental cars come preset to whatever radio station the previous driver was listening to. This one had been left on a station playing something so aggressively average and so completely dedicated to being forgettable that the brain involuntarily began searching for an explanation. That search consumed enough attention that the road ahead temporarily lost its status as the primary concern. Something alongside that road became briefly and considerably more expensive than it had been before that particular song started playing. 33. Dogs riding in sidecars while wearing goggles is not a common enough occurrence on American highways for the human brain to have developed any healthy coping response. When one appeared in the adjacent lane, doing full highway speed with the wind working on the ears and the goggles catching the light, everything stopped functioning normally. The executive function responsible for maintaining lane position simply logged off for 4 uninterrupted seconds without filing any paperwork. 4 seconds at highway speed is an extraordinarily generous window for damage to introduce itself formally. 34. Sparks flying from a bumper dragging along the highway is objectively the most gripping live entertainment available on American roads. The attention it commanded was total and completely beyond voluntary control, because watching something come apart, piece by piece, at 70 miles per hour activates a region of the brain with absolutely no interest in lane maintenance. By the time the spectacle reached its natural conclusion, the rental car had written itself into the story. It became a fully committed supporting character with its own damage report. 35. Fresh yellow parking lines painted that very morning were sitting in that lot, radiating a level of confidence that felt aggressive and borderline suspicious. The brightness coming off them suggested they had something significant to prove to everyone around them. Extending full trust to lines that were clearly trying that hard felt unwise and possibly naive. The decision to interpret their guidance loosely turned out to be precisely the wrong call because the lines were entirely correct and the car was the one with the credibility problem all along. 36. Chick-fil-A employees operate at a register of genuine warmth that no other corner of the American service industry has ever seriously attempted to match. The one working the drive-through window that afternoon was performing at a level so authentically and disturbingly kind that the brain required additional processing time to confirm the interaction had occurred in real life. That processing time lasted exactly long enough for the car sitting ahead in the lane to become an unintended and completely innocent participant in the confusion. 37. A full rotisserie chicken being actively consumed with both hands simultaneously at highway speed in the adjacent lane generates so many immediate questions about advanced planning and basic physics. Staring becomes genuinely involuntary under those circumstances, and the staring extended long enough that the painted lane markings stopped functioning as meaningful boundaries. The two lanes arrived at an informal arrangement that the rental agreement had very specifically not anticipated. Nobody at the return desk was prepared to hear the rotisserie chicken mentioned as a contributing factor. 38. Freshly repaved asphalt has a glide and a silence to it that feels fundamentally wrong when every other road in the area has spent years developing the texture and noise drivers associate with normal operation. The smoothness triggered a genuine mechanical suspicion that something had failed internally. Pulling over to investigate felt like the responsible and cautious choice. An approaching vehicle then formed a very decisive and permanent opinion about the suitability of that specific location as an appropriate stopping point for any vehicle. 39. Sunburn accumulates through a driver's side window without asking permission and without announcing itself until the repositioning begins. The repositioning was gradual and completely unconscious, in the way that physical discomfort always manages to be. The steering wheel followed each adjustment with the quiet loyalty of something calibrated to mirror every movement without question. By the time the arm finally settled into a comfortable position, the car had developed a new and costly relationship with the lane to the immediate left that was not part of the original plan. 40. Do not back up. Painted in capital letters across a sign at the parking garage, exit carries a directional meaning that becomes entirely obvious in retrospect. But in the moment, it arrived with the energy and formatting of motivational content designed to encourage persistence through difficulty. The decision to receive it personally, rather than literally, resulted in a reversal the sign had been installed specifically to prevent. It had apparently been failing at that prevention job consistently for quite some time before this particular visit added to its record. 41. Cracker Barrel restaurants are positioned along American highways at intervals specifically calculated to ambush drivers who have been traveling for 6 or more hours with their defenses completely down. The one that materialized without any advance warning after that many hours of featureless interstate activated a muscle memory so ancient and deeply embedded that the steering wheel was already committed to the exit. The conscious mind had not been formally notified that any decision was being made. The curb was included in the package without any prior announcement. 42. Funeral processions move through intersections with a gravity that demands patience, and the full length of this one was being honored with complete stillness and genuine human respect. The car count climbed past any number that retained logical coherence, and the gap that appeared looked definitive and final. The cautious inch forward turned out to be premature by approximately 45 vehicles. The procession continued without pausing, and the rental car became an attendee of something it had not been invited to and could not easily exit. 43. Parallel parking perfectly on the first attempt produces a feeling of quiet personal triumph that deserves at least a brief moment of acknowledgement. The moment was taken and the spot was appreciated from outside the vehicle with completely justified pride. Getting back in to make one small and entirely unnecessary refinement changed everything. The refinement became a correction, and the correction became an overcorrection, and the final resting position was so dramatically worse than the original that the earlier pride became documentary evidence working directly against the driver. 44. Roundabouts were introduced onto American roads by planners who had clearly never observed an American driver encountering one for the very first time in adult life. The first attempt at navigating this particular example resulted in 4 complete and unbroken loops at a speed that projected confidence without actually containing any. The exit finally selected on the 4th pass came with a curb that had been sitting there with extraordinary patience through every single lap. It was absolutely not going to be overlooked on the attempt that finally committed to leaving. 45. Overnight dew had settled across that parking lot and caught the early light in a way that was visually indistinguishable from a complete and genuine flood covering the entire surface. The braking response that followed was immediate and instinctive and came from a completely sincere place of concern. The driver behind received a sudden, unexplained brake light situation with no available context for why a flood was apparently being avoided. The lesson about the fear of water was delivered in a manner that left a permanent impression on the front end. 46. Cyclists deserve generous road space, and the space being extended was coming from a genuinely good and safety-conscious place. It kept expanding with each passing pedal stroke, because the goal of not making contact was being pursued with total and absolute dedication. That dedication kept pushing the car further toward the right until the passenger side had quietly and systematically introduced itself to an entire row of parked vehicles. The cyclist continued forward completely unaware, and that particular detail made the explanation at the return desk considerably more difficult to deliver. 47. Neon open signs flicker because of routine electrical variation that has nothing to do with intentional communication. But this particular sign was doing it in a rhythm so consistent and deliberate that it looked exactly like a message being transmitted to anyone with the patience to decode it. Slowing down to read it felt like the intellectually responsible thing to do. The curb, sitting directly outside that diner window, did not share the curiosity and registered its presence in the most efficient and direct way it knew how. 48. Mattresses loaded onto highway trucks represent one of the great and largely unresolved anxieties of American driving. The straps holding them are always visible and always appear to be doing their absolute best and never quite look like they are doing enough. The sustained concern directed at those straps across 3 consecutive miles was so thorough and consuming that the rental car's own responsibilities as a moving vehicle gradually stopped feeling urgent. The vehicle traveling directly ahead noticed that shift in priorities before anyone else on that road did. 49. Rental car seats get positioned by the previous occupant and left calibrated for a completely different set of legs than the ones that arrived next. The reach required to connect with the brake pedal under those conditions came up short by exactly 1 inch. That gap sounds almost too embarrassing to say out loud in front of another adult at a return desk. But 1 inch at the wrong pedal, in the wrong moment, in the wrong parking lot, turns out to be more than sufficient to bring an entire rental agreement to a deeply unsatisfying and permanent conclusion. And there you have it. 49 people looked a rental car agent dead in the eyes and blamed a seagull, a Walgreens, and the entire concept of fresh pavement with zero shame and maximum confidence. The audacity is truly an art form. If this video made you question humanity just a little bit, smash that like button and subscribe to BrainFumble because we find this stuff so you don't have to. Turn on notifications or you will miss the next disaster. Now tell me in the comments which excuse would you actually try to use.